Now let's understand property trigger concept. So what we are going to do, we are going to open 00 demo project that we have been using. I'm going to add one more window into it. Let's call it as window number 9. And we will be setting up window 9 as a startup window. So what we will do is, we will go to app.xaml and make a small change here. And instead of 8, now it will be 9th window. Save it. Now in window 9, we will do our UI that we need. Our very favorite layout we will put up here, a stack panel. And now we need to understand what is property trigger. So let's take an example. So we'll have a text label here or text block here. And by default, we will try to put up some sort of text into it or some color into it. And then by default, whenever some X property of the block or of the box or the button, or for that matter any control that we are going to go and pick up here, whenever some X property changes, the Y property of that same control is what we are planning to change. Again, here A property of one control is going to act as a source, so that the B property of the same control is going to go and get changed. So ultimately, same control is acting as a source and same control will be acting as a target itself. And then one can very well handle such things in the code behind itself. But then instead of we handling it in the code behind, what we are planning to do is, we are planning to do this in the XAML itself. So we won't be writing anywhere in triggers code in C#. We will be writing all the code in case of XAML itself. So here we go. I'm going to add one text block here. I'm going to name it as txt block. I'm going to have a height as in 80 and we'll give width as in 200. We'll also have a default background setup, which I won't do here. Rather, I will try to set up using style element. So here, just like we have used earlier, style element, I'll specify text block has a style here, and that is going to be a style targeting to text block itself. If you recall, this is something which we have done this before, or this is something we have already tried. And in the style, I'll put up setter. I really wish to set a background color for this control. So I'll specify I wish to set up a property called as background color, and then that value will be, let's say, gray initially. Now obviously when you run this, by default the color for text block will appear to be gray. Here it is. Now what I want to do is, whenever somebody does the mouse over on this block, or whenever somebody does the mouse press or left button click, ultimately what I want to do is, I want some transition to happen, and I want maybe the color or maybe the size or maybe the angle rotation should change for this text block itself. Obviously, since I'm talking about maybe a key pressed event or mouse left button click event, or I'm talking from the perspective of mouse over itself. Ultimately, all these events, when I have to handle this in the code behind, it's very easy. You just have to write down an event handler against the event, and then we can manage it. But as I said before, we are not going to go and manage such things in the code behind. We are going to go and get it done in the UI itself. Because ultimately, whatever is acting as a handler over here, the handler itself is going to be so-called responsible for UI change. What I mean to say is, right now color is gray, and what I want to do is, I would like to have here something called as a style specific triggers. When I say triggers, you can consider in the, you can say different languages like actions, you can consider this as events as well. So ultimately, whenever something happens, I really want some X code to execute. Now, how do I get to know that something happens? When it comes to triggers, you will find out property triggers specifically here are based on top of first of all property names. So I'll mention here a very nice property called as ease mouse over. This is inbuilt property with respect to many controls. And then this particular property, whenever the value is set up to true, then what we are interested in is, we would like to have here, just like style trigger, we would like to have here something which is called as a setter. I would like to set up a property of the current control, that is background, and that should have a value which is called as black. Now let's understand this one more time. So what I'm trying to say, whenever ease mouse over property is set to true, again somebody is monitoring this continuously, that whether ease mouse over has been set up to true or not. And then that monitoring, and whenever the system or WPF runtime gets to know that ease mouse over has happened, you will find out a trigger will be called, and that trigger will have a handler which is ultimately in a code behind. Had it been written, it would have been on some mouse over, we would have written a code like txt block dot background equal to some solid brush with the black color into it, which means same thing can be written in the code behind itself, but we are not writing a code behind, we are managing this thing in the XAML itself. It's very easy to manage such kind of a UI specific handlers in the XAML than code behind. So let's see whether it works. So as you observed here, whenever you carry a cursor in here, by default it is mouse over, set to true, it turns to black. When I take the cursor out, it regains its own default values that you will see. So it's that easy to manage the property triggers. Now what I'm going to do is, just like we have added one trigger like this, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to copy this, paste it one more time, and I will have another trigger or property added which is called as ease pressed. Whenever ease pressed value is true, I wish to handle the property. I believe this is something which is not working with respect to this text block since zigzag line. Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's try taking this property specifically with respect to one more control. So let me add one more control here. I'll keep it as it is. I'm going to copy this text block and I'm going to add one more control in here. Let's call it as button. So we will put here a button. We will have a name for the button. Let's call it as BTN. Height width we will keep it as it is. Some content we will specify. Let's call it as click me. And then we will have here a button style specified. We are interested in not having a default background color or so for the button. So I'm just going to specify here target type is going to be button. And we will have a trigger, same property trigger, but this time instead of calling it as ease mouse over, let's call it as ease pressed. So I'll specify ease pressed as in a property, and whenever its value is set to true, what I wish to do is I wish to not set a background, but let's say I wish to set up a font size here which is going to be a bigger, let's say 40 in this case. So one more time, ease pressed is a property which is just going to be set up to true automatically by WPF runtime whenever somebody presses a left mouse button on top of the button area. So ultimately, had it been handled through code, I would have written simply left mouse button click event handler in the code behind. I would have referred this button as BTN. I would have referred font size. So BTN dot font size, I would have set up the value equal to 40. Let's see what happens when we run this now. So we have two controls in the UI. One is the label and other one is the button itself. So when I carry cursor here, it turns to black. And then when I carry cursor here, this is the default transition for a button. But if I click on this, you will find out, since I have the left mouse button clicked already, I'm holding it. So you'll find out click me, the font changed. If I just leave the button, you'll find out it regains its value in terms of font size. So certain transitions are super easy in case of, or specifically from UI perspective, when it comes to triggers. So we just have written property trigger with respect to text block and property trigger with respect to button. Hopefully, I have made the point regarding property trigger clear through this demonstration. Now, what is the next thing we need to see is something called as data trigger now.